Hello everyone, we're going to have a look at intelligence and all the different aspects of that we can use when we're working with folks. The chart I've got here is one that I often use when I'm dealing with a large group of students, and what I do is I divide them into half. And a half of them I say get into groups of 3 or 4 and then describe the characteristics of the best boss you've ever had. The other half of the class I say you describe the worst boss you've ever had to a group of 3 or 4. They write down the characteristics of the best and the worst bosses they've ever had, and then I ask them to read those out, and we figure out whether or not those things are technical, intellectual, or emotional skills that the person had or didn't have. It's really interesting when you do this that always, without fail, the emotional skills are the ones that are most characteristic of the best boss and the worst boss. There are far more of the emotional skills that show up on this list than anything else. So it just helps to point out that emotional intelligence is incredibly important when you're working with people. We're going to have a look, first of all, at IQ, or intellectual intelligence. Your IQ actually peaks at about age 30, and then it gradually declines as you get older. Now, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because we know as we get older, we get wiser. So our ability to pass intelligence tests might go down, but our wisdom goes up. The reason for that probably has to do with those who are in their 20s and 30s have just been in school recently, and they have a lot of the information that is tested by the IQ tests right at their fingertips. When you get a little older, you haven't used that stuff for a while, and so it's not quite so handy to recall. But all IQ tests do is measure the kinds of things to do you learn to do in school. They don't really measure real intelligence. Intelligence tests were developed by Alfred Binet back in 1898. He was interested in intelligence, and what he did was he took a bunch of people who were geniuses and a bunch of people who were on the other end of the scale, and he measured the circumference of their skulls. Back in the days, they had phrenology. They believed that bumps on your head would be able to tell what kind of a person you were. If you had a bump up here, that was you were curious. If you had a bump over there, meant your intelligence. A bump over here meant you're hot-tempered and things like that. So they believed in phrenology. And so as a psychologist, he had been schooled in phrenology. And he thought, if that's true, then maybe what is also true is that the size of your head will determine your intelligence. If you got a big head, it means you got lots of brains, must mean you're smart. So he was measuring circumferences of skulls in these geniuses and people at the other end of the scale, and found out that, lo and behold, geniuses did have bigger heads. So he wrote this up in scientific journals and published it, and was giving a talk at an anatomy conference in Paris, France, back in 1898. And the professors of anatomy at this conference thought, wouldn't it be interesting to measure all our skulls? So they got out some tape measures, went around in the conference and measured everybody's skull, and they found that the 2 largest skulls in the room both belonged to women. So all the men at the conference concluded that intelligence has nothing to do with brain size. And so that's kind of where his research stopped. He decided he'd have to replicate his experiment again. So he went back, he got the same geniuses, the same people at the other end of the scale, and measured them all again. But this time, he had his assistant do the measuring, and the assistant got different results. And so what Dr. Binet found was that he couldn't figure this out for a while, until he realized the difference was that his assistant did not know who the geniuses were, and Dr. Binet did. So when Dr. Binet came to measure the skull of a genius, he was a little slack on the tape. When he came to somebody at the other end he knew was not very bright, he pulled it pretty tight. And so he had a self-fulfilling prophecy going on here in his experiment, and it colored the results. So when he realized that, he had to write another paper saying, hey, you know, that stuff I've been telling you about the circumference of the skull, turns out it's not true. So he came up with another kind of intelligence test. It was actually a verbal test. It became a written test at one point. But the Binet intelligence test, and Stanford University got a hold of it. It became the Stanford Binet intelligence test, and is still used today. But that's kind of the history of those intelligence tests. Phrenology and skull size turned out to be inaccurate in predicting personality or intelligence, and we can see that from some of the latest research on this. You can see this that brain size has very little to do with, or skull size at least has little to do with intelligence. Crystallized and fluid intelligence are a better way to look at intelligence in adults, because in many cases, older adults didn't have as much schooling, and so they don't come off looking as smart as people who had a lot of schooling when they were younger. That doesn't mean they're not intelligent or wise. It just means that, the IQ test is measuring their schooling, not their intelligence. You have crystallized and fluid intelligence. Your crystallized continues to increase as you get older. And what it is it's all the wisdom and the knowledge that you have. And that crystallized stays with you. The fluid intelligence is your ability to solve problems quickly. That does fall off a little bit in a lot of people as they get older. Especially after the age of 60, they tend to fall off in fluid intelligence if they don't do much with it. It doesn't have to happen that way. If they keep themselves really active and learning lots of new things, their fluid intelligence goes up rather than down. So that's good to know. Fluid intelligence is the ability to solve problems quickly, whereas the crystallized intelligence is your ability to know a lot of facts and stuff that you've learned. Aging is not an inevitable process of brain damage and decline like some people think. It's actually a complex phenomenon of reorganization, optimization, enduring functional plasticity, and so on. And this helps us to have a productive, happy life. When they've looked at reasoning ability, it looks like it peaks at about age 65. Can you figure out why that would be, that it would peak at 65? Probably has a lot to do with the fact that many people at 65 retire. And if you don't use it, you'll lose it, as Marion Diamond said. And so therefore, your intelligence drops off after 65. Your reasoning ability drops off after 65, simply because you're not using it as much. It doesn't have to happen that way. If you keep yourself really active and mentally alert, it goes out straight. It does not fall off. Another theory that's come out recently is that older brains may be a little slower in thinking simply because they're a fuller brain. They've got an awful lot more stuff in their head. The library up there is larger, and it sometimes takes longer to go find the information you want because there's so much stuff in your brain. I like this theory, and I'm going with it. The question is not how smart are you, said Howard Gardner. The question really is, how are you smart? And he came up with a theory of multiple intelligences. And he said we have all these different kinds. Linguistic is the ability to use language to write. So writers and speakers would be very high in linguistic. Barack Obama is a genius in linguistic intelligence. And Shakespeare would be as well. Musical is, of course, obvious. There's lots of people that are absolute geniuses on musical intelligence. Logical, mathematical, guys like Linus Pauling and Stephen Hawking, people like that, Einstein would all be geniuses in that area. Naturalistic is a new one, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Spatial, knowing where things are in time and space. Pilots, draftspeople, and artists, things like that, have to be very good at spatial intelligence. Bodily kinesthetic is knowing where you are in time and space. Athletes should be good in that. Wayne Gretzky knows exactly where he is, where the puck is, where everybody else is, and where everything will be in a fraction of a second. He's a genius in bodily kinesthetic. You have intrapersonal as understanding yourself, interpersonal understanding others, and how to get along with them, and existential intelligence. Kind of knowing what the meaning of life is, being able to be a bit of a philosopher and figure out what's the purpose of your life. That's existential intelligence. Moral and character intelligence may be an intelligence. Howard Gardner hasn't said it is yet, because in order to be one of these intelligences, you need an area of the brain dedicated to that intelligence, and we have all the others up there. And moral and character, they found recently, is right behind your right eyebrow. So it may well be one of these intelligences, but he hasn't said it is, and so I'm not going to say it is yet either, but because he would certainly have the right to do that. What I would like to do is just talk about naturalistic for a moment. When you look at the most serious problems there are in the world today, what do you think of these various 5 causes, or concerns at least, problems? What do you think is probably the most important? I suspect when we come back 50 years from now, all of us in the world will know that the most important one we're facing today is climate change, because that's going to be really a real problem. So climate change is the real problem of all the problems. And one of the reasons we have some problems with that is because some people don't seem to realize just how important it is to look after Mother Earth. They have what's called, in some cases, a nature deficit disorder. Young people growing up in all this technology don't realize, they don't get out enough, and they don't realize that they're part of nature. They're not above nature, they're part of it. And that's increasingly a problem in the world. And we've got to do a lot about that. In his Howard Gardner's Multiple Intelligences, he talked about intrapersonal, interpersonal, and existential. Those could all be grouped as emotional intelligence. Reuven Bar-On has developed a test for measuring emotional intelligence, and he has 15 subscales that are here. Self-regard is having a good feeling about yourself. I'm okay, that kind of feeling. Emotional self-awareness, knowing how you feel. People with anorexia and bulimia often have problems with that. They don't know how they feel. If you ask them, they don't know how they feel. They're not aware of it. Assertiveness, rather than being passive-aggressive or passive-aggressive, they're assertive. Intelligent people would be assertive rather than passive or aggressive. Independence, self-actualization is growing to become that fully functioning adult that you can become. And of course, these interpersonal ones are so incredibly important in the world. Empathy, social responsibility, being a good citizen, helping out around the world, and so on. Interpersonal relationships, and getting along with people. Those are all the interpersonal things. Adaptability would be reality testing, knowing what's real, flexible, and problem solving. Under stress management, you got stress tolerance, impulse control. You have a lot less stress if you can manage your impulses. And then optimism and happiness. If you had to guess which of these, just pause the computer for a second and look at which one of these do you think men come off higher than women? What's one that women come off higher than men? And I'll give you the answer in a second here. The women, which one of these do you think it is here? Is it A, B, C, or D? This would be a good exam question, incidentally. It turns out that women are higher in C, empathy, social responsibility, and interpersonal relationships. Women are wired for empathy. They're just naturally wired for empathy, and they're really good at social responsibility and interpersonal relationships. So they're higher in those three. What are the men higher than women in now? There's 4 choices here. Have a look at those. It turns out that men are higher in B, self-regard, stress tolerance, and optimism. That feeling that I'm good, men are better at that than women. Stress tolerance, I was surprised at, but men are actually higher in that than women. And optimism, men tend to be more optimistic. Your EQ, incidentally, is 4 times as likely to predict your success in life than your IQ is. So having a high EQ is more likely to be useful to you in getting a job, keeping a job, and being happy in life than just being very, very smart. So that's always really important to realize and to work on your emotional intelligence.